give you an overview about the EV charging market, some of the big themes and trends. I'm going to talk to you about some of the challenges that we face and some of the business models that we begin to see emerging. But I'm going to sow a seed in your minds right at the beginning of the presentation. No one is really making money out of EV charging right now. What you see essentially is a land grab. So you've got a whole bunch of players, charge point operators, people like ChargeMaster, PodPoint, and that like, utility companies, which I'll talk about, a whole host of players. What they're looking to do is effectively stake out a position, get the best sites across the country, develop their business models in the hope that those revenues grow substantially over the next few years. It's a very challenging environment now. So I think you'll expect to see quite a bit of consolidation going on in the market. Just to set the scene, nascent and fragmented market. So in terms of the charge point operators, you've got two very big players, BP, ChargeMaster, and PodPoint, and then you have a host of other smaller players. You've only got those two big players tend to have quite a large geographical coverage. I wouldn't quite say they're 100% national, but they're pretty close to it. The other smaller players, they could just look after a province, a county. They don't necessarily have a huge footprint, but lots of investment there. You've got the utilities who've been quite late to the game. So if you had looked at what was happening in the utility sector maybe about a year or so ago, there were only a couple of utilities that were investing in EV charging. Now all of them are. They're all thinking about basically how to bundle products to sell their services to EV customers, EV owners, in the hope that they can on-sell other products and services. So you're seeing a lot of utilities investing. And just to be clear, these are domestic utilities, but interestingly, overseas utilities. So companies like Vattenfall that are coming into the market, the UK market. We've had a lot of private equity and venture capital investment right at the start. So think of companies, for example, like Zook. That's the backers behind Instavolt, for example. So you've got a lot of money coming in from there. You're beginning to see some consolidation. So I've mentioned ChargeMaster several times, acquired by BP last year. Shell acquired NewMotion. And note that BP now, with ChargeMaster, beginning to roll out ultra-fast chargers across their retail network. So that's beginning to gain momentum. I think you have some really interesting adjacencies. So companies that are not the most obvious candidates to be involved in EV charging, but they have an adjacent business where they see maybe an opportunity. A good example being Global Liberty, owner of Virgin Media. They've announced that they're beginning to look at EV charging for on-street charging. So there's an opportunity there for them. If you speak to the big energy companies, they're always worried about when the tech companies are going to come in and take over. Hasn't happened yet, not in the UK. But if you look at the US, for example, Amazon is already setting an interesting precedent. So they formed a partnership with Audi for their e-tron, and more recently with Ford, where Amazon basically is providing a platform so that when you buy your car, you can actually order your home's charging unit online and arrange for the engineer to come to your home. So you begin to see a bit of that classic disruption. Some basic stats. So EV stock on the left-hand side for the UK. Public accessible chargers on the right-hand side. I think the key message here, too, one, very fast growth in the electric vehicle stock. So these are battery electric vehicles, plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, pretty much doubling year on year. Just a reality check, this is less than 1% of the current total UK fleet, but it's growing rapidly. Charging infrastructure, this is public charging infrastructure, split between fast and slow chargers, growing pretty fast as well, but at half the rate. So you've already got a nascent challenge there that some of the charging infrastructure is not keeping pace with the growth. So, oh, and just one other thing, I'll touch on it later, but if you look at the number of chargers there, 26,000 odd public chargers in the UK, there's a chart later on where there's an estimate of how many public chargers we need, and this is an open field, everybody has a different view, but it's 100-fold of that. So you'll see the numbers shortly. So we've got a long way to go. I'm sure you know all this, but it's always helpful just to start with a ground point. So when we talk about charging, essentially there are 4 different ways of charging. Home charging, workplace charging, or work charging, And I include in that fleet charging, which is a growth area, which I'm going to talk about. Destination charging, so when you go to the supermarket, leisure center, health center, and rapid charging. And I think it's fair to say that all four of these plays are growing. There's an expectation that home charging is going to be the dominant play initially, given that a large number of drivers have access to off-street parking. Clearly different if you live in cities, but generally across the UK. So there's an expectation that will definitely drive a lot of the charging there. But you're also seeing clearly demand for on-street charging. So if you live in an apartment or you don't have access to off-street parking in a city, you're seeing growth there. So the likes of Ubitricity and Chargy. So think of, for example, the lamppost charging is a good example there, trying to address some of those constraints. Workplace charging, I think the really interesting thing is the fleet charging. So it's less about charging in the workplace in terms of when you go to work every day. It's more those fleets, because these fleets are beginning to, and when I talk about fleet, I'm talking about commercial car fleets, business fleets of vans for utility companies. These companies are beginning now to announce that they're electrifying their fleets. And if you think about it, you suddenly get scale. These are enormous fleets. So given the government's ambition to grow EV adoption rates, fleet charging has a big part to play. And if you think of the business car fleets, in terms of just corporate car fleets, if that grows, you then begin to develop a second-hand market, which is not the case right now. So that gives more consumer choice, and I'll touch on consumer choice in a second. Destination charging, all I just want to say is you're seeing innovative business models, and the example of Pod Point forming a partnership with Tesco and Volkswagen is a nice example of trying to, that land grab that I mentioned, they're trying to extend their footprint across the country. And if you ever try it, they've got two business models at present. You've got a slow charger that's free, 7 kilowatts, or there's a fast charger that you pay a premium price. And a lot of these charge point operators think about dwelling time. So how long does the customer stay there? So you might go to the slow charger, charge there, do your shopping, have a coffee, quite a long time, and your car's a bit better charged. Or you go for the rapid charger, and possibly you might stay there in the car, and they're streaming advertising at you in a way to generate additional revenue. Rapid charging is really interesting because it's the one that people are trying to push as the closest thing to how you fill up at the petrol station now. So they want it to be as easy as possible. The challenge with it is that it's quite an expensive way in terms of infrastructure costs. You need to find the right location. It's quite expensive to set up the fast chargers. You need to make sure you have the right utilization, the right price point. And I think that's still, I think that the jury's out on how successful that will be, but a big opportunity there nonetheless. And interesting, Ionity, which is a big player in fast charging across Europe, they've started opening up, very early days, they've started opening up charge points in the UK, and Fastned. Instavolt would also be in this bracket as well. The cloud there, simply to say that one of the challenges we have is quite often with a lot of these, particularly the big charge point operators, they work on a subscription model. So you can land up having multiple cars to go and charge at different places. So there's a roaming partnership that's been announced recently, tend to be the smaller charge point operators, but they're trying to encourage interoperability. What are the challenges? And I'm sure you've touched on this in the previous presentations, but just a flavor, clearly high upfront costs. I mean, a lot of people talk about the total cost of ownership is much more favorable over the long term, but just buying that initial electric vehicle is challenging. You've got very nice premium brands at the top, 60, 70,000, Jaguar I-Pace. You've got the Nissan Leafs, but there's not a lot in the middle. And I think you need to have more choice there. That's been an issue. There's still concern about range anxiety. We did a project for, and I can talk about this because it's on their website, but we did a project for National Grid where we looked at range anxiety. So National Grid are proposing this solution of, I'm sure you're aware, 52 rapid charging hubs across the UK, strategically located at motorway service station areas. And they're trying to generate support for that to get it funded. It's about they're talking about £1 billion investment for that network. But we did the report for them because people are still concerned about range anxiety. We define it as perceived range anxiety, because everybody says, when I go for that long trip, what happens if I can't find a charge point? And the reality is most trips in the UK are about 20 miles a day, but they're still worried about it. So it's still an issue, but if you go on the National Grid website, you can see the report that we did go in a bit more detail. Clearly concern about access to charging infrastructure, everything from where there's coverage or visibility of charge points. And I think the last one I just flag is, quite rightly, we talk a lot about the environmental benefits of electric vehicles, but for the time being, they're very strong economic arguments. If you can get over that upfront cost in terms of savings on the tax, the running costs, certainly everyone I've spoken to who've had an electric vehicle talk about saving enormous amounts once they own it. It's going to be expensive to build up this charging infrastructure. So I mentioned National Grid there with their, I think it's between 500 to a billion investment they're talking about. Labour, interestingly, came out with a pledge to expand the EV charging network, and they were talking about $3.5 billion to spend on that. And Scottish Power came out with decarbonisation of the whole of the light vehicle duty transport sector in the UK, and that was coming in at around about 46 billion. So these are very large sums of money. And I guess the big question, you've got some bullet points there, but I think the big question is who pays for this? The government is pretty stretched as it is. They've made strategic investments, charging infrastructure fund, for example. Consumers, I think, consumers, I'm not sure if they realize what they're on the hook for. Most of us, I think, want to invest in this, but how much will it cost? And I think that's something we need to be very clear about. But I do think this is a theme that I keep talking about at events, is the importance of partnership between government and private sector. Because I think you need, if you have the government that provides regulatory certainty and you have the private sector bring its innovation, if those two can work together, there are ways to develop commercial models to make this more successful. This is the last slide, and a very busy slide. And I just wanted to highlight just the different business models that we see emerging. So if you look at the top left-hand side, automotive OEMs, why are they investing in charging? Well, clearly they're looking to sell their cars. So they're investing in the infrastructure to pave the way to make it easier to sell the volume of electric vehicles that will be coming onto the market. But don't think they're just doing that. There's a lovely example there of Volkswagen. They've set up this subsidiary called Eli. And essentially, to me, it sounds like it's a utility company. So this is a subsidiary of an automotive OEM, and they're going to offer electricity for home customers, green, renewably sourced. They're going to install EV chargers at home, all the attributes of a utility, and that's an automotive company. You've got the utilities, which I've talked a little bit about. I mean, I guess, on the one side, they clearly have a huge opportunity because as EVs take off, there will be increased demand for electricity, so great. I think they're thinking one step further is if they can supply that electricity, bundle their product offering, renewably sourced power for your EV customer. There is this evolutionary journey with electric vehicle drivers that when they buy their vehicle, they suddenly realize their electricity bill goes up. They then try and source a more attractive provider of power that's renewably sourced. They then start thinking about maybe putting solar panels on their roof. There's a whole journey there, and I think those utility companies are thinking about how they can get into it, and they're quite ambitious. EDF, the French utility, is talking about owning. They never quite define what they mean by owning, but let's just take it at a high level, owning 30% of the charging market across Europe in particular geographies, and one of them being the UK. Oil and gas companies, I think you're all well acquainted there. I think the big thing with them is they're looking at this two ways. I think on the one hand, and this is probably not the right word, but it gets the sentiment across, they're hedging their business. So simply by putting chargers on your retail outlets, if the whole world in the UK moves towards electric vehicles, you've still got custom coming to the retail outlet, and you still make money on your non-fuel items. So smart. But I think they're also thinking further down the line that they're seeing the world electrify. They're seeing the energy system electrify, which is this bottom line here. so that they're looking at different ways to own the customer. So you've got some of these oil companies beginning to go into power supply. Think of Shell acquiring First Utility. So they're thinking about trying to own the customer right across the value chain. And then you have, finally, some of these other players, the adjacencies, the tech players. So a fascinating area. I can see Nikki standing up, so I'm going to bring it to a close very quickly. Fascinating. Lots of opportunities there. I think the golden rule is they're still figuring it out. But clearly, those companies that get the right business model in place will be well placed in the future. And certainly, this will be key to building up the infrastructure in the UK. All right. Thank you very much for your time.